Cody woke up to the sound of heavy machinery growling in the distance. At first, he thought it was coming from another neighborhood. The new developments weren't far from his property, and construction crews were often busy at work early in the mornings. But as the sound grew louder, a low rumbling accompanied by the unmistakable crash of wood being shattered, a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. This noise wasn't coming from a distant street. It was coming from his backyard. Throwing on a pair of jeans and a flannel shirt, Cody ran down the stairs and out the back door, his boots thudding against the wooden steps. His property was modest, but it was his pride and joy. A house he had purchased 10 years ago after leaving the chaos of the city. The barn, however, was the heart of it all. It had been built by his grandfather in the late 1940s and had stood proudly ever since. To Cody, the barn wasn't just a structure. It was a testament to his family's resilience, a place that housed cherished memories of childhood summers spent with his grandparents. As he rounded the corner of his house, the sight that greeted him made his heart drop. A yellow bulldozer was rolling over what remained of his barn, its massive blades smashing into the wooden walls, sending splinters flying. A small crew of workers in hard hats stood nearby, some hauling away pieces of debris, others shouting instructions. The barn, his family's legacy, was being reduced to a pile of rubble before his very eyes. "What the hell are you doing?" Cody shouted, his voice cracking with fury. He sprinted toward the scene, waving his arms to get the workers' attention. One of them, a middle-aged man in a neon safety vest, looked up from his clipboard, clearly startled. The bulldozer rumbled to a stop as Cody reached the site, breathing heavily from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Who authorized this?" Cody demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. "This is my property. What gives you the right to tear down my barn?" The man in the safety vest, whose name tag read Mike, held up his hands defensively. "Whoa, sir, calm down," he said, his tone cautious. "We're just following orders. We were told this structure was in violation of homeowner association regulations and needed to be removed." Cody stared at him in disbelief. "Violation of homeowner association regulations?" he repeated. "That's ridiculous. This barn has been here for decades, long before there was even a homeowner association in this neighborhood." Mike shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "Look, I'm just the contractor. The president of your homeowner association, Karen Wilson, signed the order. She told us everything was cleared and that the homeowner was notified." Cody felt a surge of rage boil up inside him. Karen Wilson. Of course it was her. She had been a thorn in his side ever since she became the homeowner association president 2 years ago. Karen was the kind of person who thrived on control and wielded her authority like a weapon. She was notorious for enforcing the most trivial homeowner association rules with an iron fist, from the exact shade of paint allowed for front doors to the placement of trash bins on collection day. But this was beyond anything she had done before. "I wasn't notified of anything," Cody snapped, his hands clenched into fists. "She didn't even have the decency to call me before destroying something that's been on my property for nearly 80 years. Mike shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at his crew. "Look, sir, I don't want any trouble. If you have an issue, you'll need to take it up with the homeowner association. We were just hired to do the job." Cody gritted his teeth, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his temper in check. He turned on his heel and stormed back toward his house, his mind racing. He had to confront Karen immediately, but first, he needed proof of what was happening. Pulling his phone from his pocket, he began snapping photos of the destruction. What was left of the barn's frame, the piles of wood and debris, the bulldozer idling in the background. He even captured a photo of Mike and his crew, their faces etched with unease. After gathering as much evidence as he could, Cody climbed into his truck and drove the short distance to Karen's house. She lived at the end of the cul-de-sac in a pristine 2-story home with a perfectly manicured lawn and flower beds that looked like they had been plucked straight from a gardening magazine. Her house was the epitome of what she wanted the neighborhood to represent. Clean, uniform, and completely devoid of individuality. Cody parked his truck in her driveway and marched up to the front door, his fists clenched at his sides. He jabbed the doorbell with his finger, the chime echoing through the house. A few moments later, the door swung open, and there stood Karen Wilson. She was a petite woman in her late 50s with sharp features and a calculating glint in her eyes. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in a tailored blazer and slacks, as if she were attending a board meeting rather than relaxing at home. "Cody," she said coolly, folding her arms across her chest. "What a surprise! To what do I owe the pleasure?" Cody took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "Karen, Why is there a bulldozer tearing down my barn? Her expression didn't change. If anything, she seemed almost amused. Your barn was in violation of homeowner association regulations, she said matter-of-factly. It didn't meet the community's aesthetic standards, and it posed a safety risk. As president, it's my duty to ensure the neighborhood adheres to our guidelines. Cody stared at her, incredulous. Aesthetic standards? Safety risk? That barn has been standing longer than any house in this neighborhood. It's part of my property, Karen. You had no right to touch it, let alone demolish it without my consent. Karen raised an eyebrow, her tone turning condescending. I don't need your consent, Cody. The homeowner association has the authority to enforce community regulations as we see fit, and as I mentioned, you were notified of the decision. Notified? Cody practically shouted. I never received any notification. No letter, no email, no phone call. Karen shrugged, an infuriatingly smug smile playing on her lips. Well, perhaps you should check your mail more often. We sent multiple letters outlining the issue and the timeline for removal. It's not my fault if you chose to ignore them. Cody felt his blood boil. He knew Karen was lying. He was meticulous about checking his mail, and there hadn't been a single letter from the homeowner association about the barn. This was a power move, plain and simple, a blatant abuse of her authority. And now, his family's legacy lay in ruins because of it. This isn't over, Karen, he said through gritted teeth, his voice low and filled with fury. You can't just bulldoze people's property and expect to get away with it. I'll see you in court if I have to. Karen's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. Do what you must, Cody, she said dismissively. But the homeowner association operates within the law, and I have nothing to hide. Good luck with your little crusade. With that, she closed the door in his face, leaving Cody seething on her doorstep. As he walked back to his truck, he resolved to fight back with everything he had. Karen had crossed a line, and he wasn't about to let her get away with it. She might have thought she was untouchable, but Cody was about to prove her wrong. Cody spent the rest of the day pacing his living room, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. The barn was gone, reduced to rubble in a matter of hours, and Karen's smug response only fueled his determination. He knew he couldn't let this slide, but before taking any action, he needed to gather evidence. If he was going to confront the homeowner association and possibly take legal action, he had to be prepared. The first step was to go through his records. Cody kept meticulous files on all his property documents, including anything related to the homeowner association. He pulled out a heavy file box from his office closet and began sifting through papers. Deeds, property tax receipts, and past homeowner association notices. All of it was there. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's claim about notifying him was a lie. He had never seen or received anything about the barn being in violation. He found the most recent homeowner association newsletter, dated 2 months earlier. It included the usual updates about landscaping rules and a reminder to keep trash bins hidden from view, but nothing about new regulations or aesthetic changes. Then he found the annual homeowner association meeting minutes from the previous year, which detailed the agenda items discussed. Again, there was no mention of the barn or any changes to the community's rules regarding structures. Cody began to feel a glimmer of hope. If there was no formal documentation, Karen might have acted on her own without proper authority from the homeowner association board. That would mean her actions were not just unethical, they were illegal. But until then, Karen couldn't ponder. Still, he needed more than just his own records to prove it. He decided to visit his neighbor Claudia, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else. Claudia was a retired school teacher with a sharp memory and an even sharper eye for detail. If anyone knew what was going on with the homeowner association, it would be her. Cody walked over to Claudia's house, a modest 2-story home with a garden that seemed to bloom year-round. She greeted him at the door with a warm smile, but her expression quickly turned to concern when she saw the look on his face. "Cody, what's wrong?" she asked, ushering him inside. "It's the barn," Cody said, his voice tight with frustration. "Karen had it bulldozed this morning. She claims it violated homeowner association rules, but I never got any notice." Claudia's eyes widened in shock. "She did what? That barn has been there forever. Everyone in the neighborhood knows it's part of your family's history. How could she do something so cruel?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Cody replied. "I've been going through my records, but there's nothing about new rules or violations. I was hoping you might know if this was discussed at any of the meetings." Claudia nodded thoughtfully. "Let me grab my notes. I always take detailed minutes at those meetings." They're usually more accurate than the official ones the homeowner association sends out. She disappeared into her study and returned a few minutes later with a spiral notebook. Flipping through the pages, she paused and frowned. "Here it is," she said, pointing to an entry dated 6 months ago. There was a brief mention of addressing non-compliant structures, but it was vague. Karen didn't specify what that meant, and when someone asked for clarification, she brushed it off, saying it would be discussed in more detail later. As far as I know, it never came up again. Cody leaned over to read the notes. It was exactly as Claudia had described. Karen had used broad, ambiguous language that could be interpreted in 100 different ways. It was a deliberate tactic, Cody realized, to avoid scrutiny while laying the groundwork for her own agenda. "This is helpful, Claudia," Cody said, "but it still doesn't explain how she managed to push this through without anyone knowing." Claudia's face darkened. "Karen's been abusing her power for years. She bullies the other board members into agreeing with her, and when someone challenges her, she finds a way to shut them down. You're not the first person she's targeted, Cody. She's fined people for having the wrong shade of mulch and even threatened to tow a neighbor's car because it was parked half an inch over the driveway line." Cody shook his head in disbelief. "And no one's done anything about it?" "We've tried," Claudia said with a sigh. "But Karen's clever. She knows how to manipulate the rules and cover her tracks. Most people are too intimidated to stand up to her." "Well, I'm not intimidated," Cody said firmly. "She's gone too far this time. I'm going to hold her accountable, no matter what it takes." Claudia smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Good. Let me know how I can help. This neighborhood deserves better than Karen Wilson." Armed with Claudia's notes, Cody felt more confident about his next steps. He decided to reach out to other neighbors who might have had similar experiences with Karen. Over the next few days, he went door to door, explaining what had happened to his barn and asking if anyone else had been unfairly targeted by the homeowner association. The response was overwhelming. Nearly every homeowner he spoke to had a story about Karen's heavy-handed tactics, from unjust fines to threats of legal action. One neighbor, Tom, revealed that Karen had once tried to force him to repaint his house because she didn't like the color, even though it was within the approved palette. Another, Maria, recounted how Karen had fined her for installing a garden fence without approval, despite the fact that the fence was temporary and not visible from the street. As Cody collected these stories, a pattern began to emerge. Karen was not just enforcing the rules, she was creating them on the fly to suit her own preferences and punishing anyone who didn't comply. It was clear that her actions were not just unethical, but likely illegal. Cody decided it was time to consult a lawyer. He scheduled a meeting with a local attorney, Mary Whitaker, who specialized in property law and homeowner association disputes. Mary listened intently as Cody explained the situation, nodding as he laid out the evidence he had gathered. "It sounds like you have a strong case," Mary said when he finished. "Homeowner associations have a lot of authority, but that authority is not unlimited. They have to follow their own rules and bylaws, and from what you've told me, Karen Wilson has been blatantly violating those. If she issued a demolition order without proper board approval or notification, she's liable for damage." "What about the other stories I've collected from neighbors?" Cody asked. "Does that help my case?" "Absolutely," Mary replied. "It establishes a pattern of abuse and shows that this isn't an isolated incident. We can use it to argue that Karen has been acting in bad faith and exceeding her authority as homeowner association president." Cody felt a surge of relief. For the first time since the barn had been destroyed, he felt like he had a real chance of winning. Mary outlined the next steps. They would file a formal complaint against Karen and the homeowner association, demand compensation for the destruction of the barn, and request a full investigation into Karen's conduct as president. If the homeowner association board refused to cooperate, they would take the case to court. As Cody left Mary's office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Karen might have thought she could get away with destroying his barn, but she had underestimated him. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone in the neighborhood who had been wronged by her, and he wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Cody woke up the morning after meeting with Mary feeling a mix of determination and anxiety. He had never been involved in a legal battle before, let alone one against an entire homeowner association. But as he stepped outside and saw the empty patch of land where his barn once stood, any lingering doubts evaporated. This wasn't just about the barn anymore. It was about holding Karen accountable and ensuring no one else in the neighborhood suffered the way he had. Mary wasted no time getting started. She filed an official complaint against the homeowner association on Cody's behalf, citing property destruction, negligence, and abuse of authority. The complaint demanded financial compensation for the loss of the barn, reimbursement of legal fees, and a formal investigation into Karen Wilson's leadership. Alongside the legal action, Mary suggested Cody contact local media outlets to bring attention to the situation. A public spotlight could pressure the homeowner association board and make it harder for Karen to sweep the issue under the rug. Initially hesitant about going public, Cody realized it was the right move. Karen had relied on intimidation and secrecy to maintain her power. Exposing her actions to the wider community would weaken her grip. With Mary's help, Cody reached out to a reporter at the local newspaper, who was immediately interested in the story. A few days later, an article was published, with the headline, "Homeowner Association President Under Fire for Bulldozing Historic Barn." The article included photos of the destroyed barn, quotes from Cody about the emotional toll of losing his family's legacy, and statements from neighbors who had experienced Karen's overreach. It also highlighted the broader implications of unchecked homeowner association authority, which struck a chord with readers across the county. Within hours of the article going live, Cody's phone began buzzing with calls and messages. Neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years reached out to offer support, and even strangers sent encouraging words. Karen, however, was not pleased. That afternoon, Cody received a letter from the homeowner association, signed by Karen, accusing him of defamation and demanding a retraction of his statements to the press. The letter was laced with legal jargon and threats of countersuits, but Cody wasn't fazed. He forwarded it to Mary, who assured him it was a baseless attempt to scare him into silence. "This is exactly the kind of behavior we're fighting against," Mary said during their next meeting. "Karen is doubling down because she knows she's in trouble, but we're going to use this to our advantage. The more she tries to intimidate you, the worse she looks in front of the court." Over the next few weeks, the case began to gain momentum. Mary filed a discovery request, compelling the homeowner association to produce internal documents related to the barn's demolition. What they uncovered was damning. Emails between Karen and the construction company revealed that she had authorized the demolition weeks before notifying the homeowner association board, or Cody. In one email, Karen described the barn as a blight on the neighborhood and instructed the contractor to take care of it as soon as possible. Another email showed that Karen had pressured the homeowner association treasurer into approving the funds for the demolition without a formal vote. Even more shocking was a memo Karen had written to the board but never shared. In it, she outlined plans to use the land where the barn once stood to build a private playground for her grandchildren, disguised as a community improvement project. The memo included sketches of the proposed design and estimated costs, which Karen planned to offset by increasing homeowner association fees for all residents. And from there, she went further than that. She invited homeowner association fees for all residents. When Mary showed Cody the documents, his anger boiled over. "She was planning this from the start," he said through gritted teeth. "This wasn't about regulations or aesthetics. It was about her own selfish agenda." "It's worse than that," Mary replied. "These documents prove she acted without the board's approval, misused homeowner association funds, and violated multiple bylaws. This is exactly what we needed to strengthen your case." With the evidence in hand, Mary prepared for the next step, mediation. Before taking the case to court, the law required both parties to attempt to resolve the dispute through a neutral mediator. Cody wasn't optimistic about mediation, but Mary assured him it was a necessary step and one that could work in their favor if Karen continued to dig her own grave. The mediation session was scheduled for a Friday morning at a local courthouse. Cody arrived early, dressed in a suit he hadn't worn since his cousin's wedding years ago. Mary greeted him with a reassuring smile, her briefcase packed with evidence and notes. Karen arrived a few minutes later, accompanied by the homeowner association's attorney. She looked as smug as ever, but Cody noticed a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes as she glanced at Mary's confident demeanor. The mediator, a middle-aged man with a calm and measured tone, began by outlining the process. Each side would have an opportunity to present their case, followed by a discussion to explore potential resolutions. Karen's attorney went first, arguing that the demolition was justified because the barn violated homeowner association regulations and posed a safety hazard. He claimed Cody had been notified multiple times but failed to respond, leaving the homeowner association no choice but to act. When it was Mary's turn, she methodically dismantled their arguments. She presented the emails, the memo, and Claudia's notes, proving that Karen had acted unilaterally and without proper authority. She also pointed out inconsistencies in the homeowner association's claims, such as the lack of documented safety inspections or official notices sent to Cody. By the time Mary finished, the mediator was frowning, and Karen's confidence had visibly eroded. When it came time for open discussion, Karen tried to defend herself, but her arguments quickly unraveled under scrutiny. At one point, she became so flustered that she blurted out, "The barn was an eyesore. It didn't belong in this neighborhood." Her outburst only served to reinforce the perception that her actions were personal rather than professional. The mediation ended without a resolution, as Cody had expected, but Mary assured him this was a win. "She showed her true colors today," Mary said as they left the courthouse. "That's going to hurt her credibility if this goes to trial." Back at home, Cody felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The process was far from over, but for the first time he felt like the tide was turning in his favor. Karen's facade of authority was crumbling, and the community was rallying behind him. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak out were now openly criticizing Karen's leadership, and some even began organizing a petition to have her removed as homeowner association president. As the days passed, Cody found himself flooded with support from all sides. His story had struck a chord not just in his neighborhood but across the city, where other homeowners were sharing similar experiences with overreaching homeowner associations. The local newspaper published a follow-up article highlighting the evidence uncovered during discovery and calling Karen's actions a textbook case of homeowner association abuse. Through it all, Cody remained focused on the ultimate goal: justice. He wasn't just fighting for his barn. He was fighting for the principle that no one should have to endure the kind of abuse and intimidation Karen had inflicted on their community. And with Mary by his side, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. Cody had barely settled back into his routine after the mediation when he received a call from Mary. Her voice, calm but charged with purpose, cut through his groggy morning mood. "We've got a court date," she said. "The homeowner association's attorney didn't file a settlement offer, which means Karen is digging in her heels. This is going to trial." Cody had anticipated this, but hearing it said aloud sent a shiver of anxiety through him. He had hoped Karen would see the mounting evidence against her and back down, but her stubbornness, and likely her pride, kept her from doing the sensible thing. Still, if she wanted to fight this battle in court, Cody was ready to meet her there. Mary assured him they were in a strong position. The evidence they had collected was overwhelming, and Karen's behavior during mediation had done nothing to help her case. Now it was about presenting the story clearly and convincingly to the judge, showing not only that Karen had overstepped her authority, but also that her actions were malicious and calculated. The weeks leading up to the trial were intense. Cody met with Mary frequently, going over every detail of the case. She walked him through the testimony he would give, coached him on how to remain calm under cross-examination, and rehearsed the key points they wanted to highlight. At the same time, Mary's team prepared their exhibits: emails, meeting notes, photos of the demolished barn, and statements from neighbors who had experienced Karen's overreach. They even included a historical photograph of Cody's grandfather standing proudly in front of the barn, a reminder of what had been lost. Meanwhile, the community's support for Cody continued to grow. The petition to remove Karen as homeowner association president had gained hundreds of signatures, and several neighbors planned to attend the trial as witnesses or observers. Local news outlets covered the story extensively, framing it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked homeowner association power. Cody couldn't walk down the street without someone stopping him to offer words of encouragement or share their own frustrations with Karen's leadership. The morning of the trial arrived with an air of nervous anticipation. Cody dressed in a dark suit, his tie knotted tightly around his neck, and took a deep breath as he stepped into the courthouse. The courtroom was a modest space, with rows of wooden benches and a raised platform where the judge presided. It was already packed with spectators, including neighbors, reporters, and a handful of unfamiliar faces who had likely been drawn by the media coverage. Karen was seated at the defendant's table, her expression carefully neutral. She wore a tailored navy blazer and skirt, her posture rigid, as if determined to project an air of authority. Her attorney, a middle-aged man with a graying beard, whispered something to her, and she nodded curtly. Cody felt a flicker of satisfaction, knowing that her calm facade was likely masking a storm of anxiety. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, entered the courtroom, and the proceedings began. The homeowner association's attorney delivered his opening statement first, painting Karen as a dutiful leader who had acted in the best interests of the community. He argued that the barn posed a safety risk and that Cody had failed to respond to multiple notices, leaving Karen no choice but to take action. When it was Mary's turn, she approached the bench with a quiet confidence that filled Cody with reassurance. She began by acknowledging the importance of homeowner associations in maintaining community standards, but quickly shifted to dismantling the narrative presented by Karen's attorney. Mary described how Karen had acted unilaterally, bypassing proper procedures and violating the homeowner association's bylaws. She highlighted the lack of safety inspections, the absence of formal notices, and the emails that revealed Karen's true intentions. As the trial progressed, Mary called several witnesses to the stand, each of whom provided compelling testimony. Claudia was the first, recounting her detailed notes from the homeowner association meetings and describing how Karen had used vague language to avoid scrutiny. Tom, another neighbor, testified about the fines and threats he had received over minor infractions, painting a picture of Karen as a tyrant who ruled through fear. Maria spoke about how Karen had targeted her garden fence, emphasizing the personal nature of Karen's vendettas against homeowners who didn't conform to her vision. When it was Cody's turn to testify, he felt a knot of nervous energy tighten in his stomach. Mary had prepared him for this moment, but sitting in the witness box, under the scrutiny of the judge, the attorneys, and the audience, was a daunting experience. He took a deep breath, recalling Mary's advice to stay calm and focus on the facts. He began by describing the morning he discovered the barn being demolished, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. He talked about the history of the barn, how it had been built by his grandfather and represented a piece of his family's legacy. As he spoke, he could see the judge nodding slightly, her expression softening as she listened. Karen's attorney attempted to rattle him during cross-examination, questioning why he hadn't responded to the alleged notices and suggesting that he was exaggerating the barn's significance. But Cody held his ground, calmly pointing out the lack of evidence that any notices had been sent and emphasizing the personal and historical value of the barn. By the time he stepped down, he felt a sense of relief, knowing he had done his part. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Mary introduced the memo Karen had written but never shared with the homeowner association board. As the document was projected onto a screen for the courtroom to see, a murmur rippled through the audience. The memo outlined Karen's plans to build a private playground on Cody's property, using homeowner association funds and increasing fees to cover the costs. It was a smoking gun, proof that Karen's actions were driven by self-interest rather than community concerns. Karen's attorney tried to downplay the memo, arguing that it was merely a proposal and had no bearing on the decision to demolish the barn. But the damage was done. The judge's expression hardened as she read through the memo, and Cody could see Karen shifting uncomfortably in her seat. In her closing arguments, Mary tied everything together, emphasizing the pattern of abuse, the lack of due process, and the personal motivations behind Karen's actions. She urged the court to hold Karen accountable, not just for the destruction of the barn, but for the broader harm she had caused to the community. When the judge finally adjourned for deliberation, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Cody sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly together as he waited for the verdict. The minutes felt like hours, but eventually the judge returned, her expression unreadable. In a firm and measured tone, she delivered her decision. The court found in favor of Cody, ruling that Karen had acted outside the scope of her authority and violated multiple homeowner association bylaws. The homeowner association was ordered to pay Cody substantial damages for the loss of the barn, cover his legal fees, and conduct a full audit of its operations. The judge also recommended Karen's immediate removal as president, citing her blatant abuse of power. The courtroom erupted in a mix of applause and gasps. Cody felt a wave of relief wash over him as Mary turned to him with a triumphant smile. He had done it. Justice had been served. As Cody left the courthouse that day, surrounded by neighbors and well-wishers, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. The barn was gone, but its legacy would live on, not just in his memories, but in the victory he had won for himself and his community. And for the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine a future free from Karen's tyranny, where his neighborhood could finally thrive in peace. End of Part 1. The courtroom victory was a moment of immense relief and satisfaction for Cody, but as he stepped outside into the fresh air, he knew the battle wasn't entirely over. While the judge ruling had delivered justice, the repercussions of the case were just beginning to unfold. For Karen Wilson, the fallout was immediate and severe. By the end of the week, an emergency homeowner association board meeting was called to address the court's recommendation for her removal as president. Cody received an invitation to attend as a concerned homeowner, and although he had no desire to see Karen again, he felt a sense of responsibility to make sure the board followed through. The meeting was held in the community center, a modest building that doubled as a venue for neighborhood events. Cody arrived early, greeted by several neighbors who had come to show their support. The atmosphere was tense but energized. The air buzzed with whispers of Karen's misdeeds and speculation about what would happen next. Karen herself entered just before the meeting started, her usual air of confidence noticeably diminished. She avoided making eye contact with anyone as she took her seat at the head of the table, but her stiff posture and clenched jaw betrayed her frustration. The other board members, many of whom had been complicit in Karen's reign of control, looked uneasy as well, shifting in their seats and avoiding the murmuring crowd. When the meeting began, the board's secretary read aloud the court's ruling and the judge's recommendation for Karen's removal. The room was silent except for the rustle of papers and the occasional cough. When the secretary finished, Karen finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed the room. "This has all been blown out of proportion," she began, trying to sound authoritative but coming off defensive. "Yes, mistakes were made, but I've always acted in the best interest of this community. I've dedicated years of my life to making this neighborhood a better place, and I don't deserve to be vilified for it." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd, but Cody remained silent, waiting for the right moment. One of the board members, an elderly man named Frank, cleared his throat and spoke up. "Karen," he said, his tone measured, "we've supported you for years, but what you did to Cody's barn crossed a line. The evidence presented in court made it clear that you acted without consulting the board or the homeowners. This isn't just a matter of mistakes, it's a matter of trust, and that trust has been broken." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Frank held up a hand to stop her. "This meeting isn't about excuses," he continued. "It's about moving forward. The judge recommended your removal, and as a board, we owe it to this community to take action." At that moment, Cody stood up from his seat in the audience. The room quieted as he made his way to the front. Karen glared at him, but he ignored her, addressing the board and the crowd instead. "I'm not here to gloat or celebrate," he began, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about my barn. It's about the way this community has been run for far too long. Karen has abused her power, targeted individuals, and put her own interests ahead of everyone else's. The court made the right decision, but now it's up to all of us to make sure this doesn't happen again." He turned to the board members, meeting their eyes one by one. "I'm asking you to do the right thing. Remove Karen as president and start rebuilding the trust she destroyed. This neighborhood deserves better." The room erupted in applause, and even some of the board members nodded in agreement. Karen, however, was seething. She stood abruptly, slamming her hands on the table. "You have no idea what it takes to run this homeowner association," she snapped, her voice rising. "Do you think you can do better? Do you think anyone here can? Without me, this place will fall apart." The crowd's reaction was swift and vocal, with several people shouting back at her. The board secretary called for order, banging her gavel until the room quieted down. "Karen," she said firmly, "this isn't about what you think of yourself. It's about what the community needs. And right now, the community needs new leadership." The vote to remove Karen was unanimous. As the decision was announced, Karen stood frozen for a moment, her face a mask of shock and anger. Then, without a word, she gathered her belongings and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The crowd erupted into cheers, and for the first time in years, Cody felt a sense of hope for the neighborhood's future. In the days that followed, the board began the process of electing a new president. Several neighbors approached Cody, urging him to run, but he declined. While he was proud of what he had accomplished, he knew he wasn't the right person to lead the homeowner association. Instead, he threw his support behind Frank, whose steady demeanor and commitment to fairness made him the ideal candidate. Frank won the election by a landslide, and one of his first acts as president was to introduce new measures for transparency and accountability within the homeowner association. As for Cody, he turned his attention to rebuilding the barn. With the compensation awarded by the court, he hired a local construction company to recreate the structure as closely as possible to the original. The process was bittersweet. Every nail hammered into place reminded him of what had been lost, but it also represented a fresh start. He decided to incorporate a small plaque into the design, dedicating the barn to his grandfather and the legacy of resilience that had carried him through the ordeal. The grand reopening of the barn became a community event. Neighbors gathered to celebrate, bringing food, drinks, and laughter to the once quiet property. Even the local news showed up to cover the story, framing it as a tale of triumph over adversity. Cody stood by the barn's entrance, shaking hands and accepting hugs from friends and strangers alike. It was a day of closure, not just for him, but for the entire neighborhood. In the months that followed, the community began to heal. Under Frank's leadership, the Homeowner Association shifted its focus to supporting homeowners rather than policing them. New committees were formed to address issues like landscaping and neighborhood events, giving residents a voice in decisions that affected their lives. The oppressive atmosphere that had once hung over the neighborhood was replaced by a sense of collaboration and mutual respect. Cody, too, found a renewed sense of peace. The barn, now restored to its former glory, became a place of reflection and inspiration. On quiet evenings, he would sit on its steps, watching the sun set over the horizon, and feel a deep gratitude for the journey he had endured. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. In the end, Karen's downfall wasn't just about justice for Cody. It was a turning point for the entire community. Her removal marked the end of an era of fear and control and the beginning of a new chapter defined by unity and empowerment. For Cody, it was proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, standing up for what's right could make all the difference. And as he gazed out at the barn, its silhouette framed against the fading light, he knew his grandfather would be proud.